Good day. Today is Tuesday, 21st January 2025, and as you can probably tell from my voice, I am again somewhat below the weather. I've contracted a cold that has been circulating through my family. Well, nonetheless, I'm intending to do a program today. We'll see how far my voice holds, and I'm doing it because momentous events are taking place. And yesterday, we had, of course, the inauguration of President Donald Trump. He's no longer President-elect Trump. He is now constitutionally and in terms of power, the President of the United States, invested with all the powers given to that office by the Constitution. And he delivered a very, very remarkable inaugural address. Very, very different from every other inaugural address I've heard delivered in the United States, in Washington. Now, I would include that in that Donald Trump's own inaugural address of 2016. Now, that too was different from the others, but nonetheless, it still was different from the one we had yesterday. It painted a much darker picture. And it was very interesting to listen to Trump because on the one hand, he set out all the things that he thought had gone very badly wrong with the United States, but he conveyed at the same time an extraordinary optimism that with him in charge, all of these problems would be solved, that they would be put right. Now, living in Britain, the contrast with Keir Starmer is actually quite remarkable. Keir Starmer became Prime Minister, and then he and his Chancellor went around telling everybody how bad things were, and then went on to say that, in fact, at least in the short term, and perhaps even the medium term, they were going to get worse. And that cast a pall of gloom across the country, whereas Trump's approach, I suspect, will appear exhilarating to many people. Now, I'm going to say this. I think that in 2016, Donald Trump had only been in politics, 2017, I should say, Donald Trump had only been in politics for just under 2 years. He had not yet found his full political voice. I think in this inaugural address, he did so. The thing that stood out for me was his extraordinary belief that he knows what the problems are and that he, and arguably no one else, is in a position to put them right. I've not heard any US president talk in that way. You could argue that in 1933, Franklin Roosevelt did. Perhaps he did. But certainly not in my lifetime have I heard a speech in which the president spoke out about the terrible condition of the country and yet simultaneously managed to convey a shining faith in his own ability to put it right. Now, in saying that this is completely different from any other inaugural address I can remember, and my memory extends back to Richard Nixon's, just saying the first Nixon inaugural address. I should say that there is one orator who this does slightly remind me of, and that is actually Oliver Cromwell, character from British history. So compare, for example, these words in the inaugural address. As we gather today, our government confronts a crisis of trust. For many years, a radical and corrupt establishment has extracted power and wealth from our citizens, while the pillars of our society lay broken and seemingly in complete disrepair. We now have a government that cannot manage even a simple crisis at home, whilst at the same time stumbling into a continuing catalogue of catastrophic events abroad. And there's an awful lot more and he talks very harshly about the government that preceded him, which obviously is Joe Biden's government. But one gets the sense that he's basically talking about all of the other governments that preceded him, going perhaps all the way back to Ronald Reagan. Now, compare that with these words of Oliver Cromwell to the Long Parliament. Have you not defiled the sacred place and turned the Lord's temple into a den of thieves by your immoral principles and wicked practices? You are grown intolerably odious to the whole nation. You were deputed here by the people to get their grievances redressed. Are yourselves gone. So take away that shining bauble there and lock up the doors. In the name of God, go. Well, the English is different. Obviously, we're talking about different centuries. But again, the sense that the leader in question, in that case Cromwell, is confronting a corrupt, incompetent, self-seeking establishment that has made a complete mess of the nation's affairs, and that he, Cromwell, and no one else is in a position to turn things round. Well, the similarity of all of that to Donald Trump's inaugural address, I found interesting. Now, having said all of that, I do appreciate that there are different opinions about Cromwell. Some people think that he was a cruel dictator and a despot and a hypocrite. Others see him as the man who ultimately set England on the road towards a form of parliamentary democracy. For the record, I hold to the second view. But I'm not here to debate intentions, and I'm not going to push the similarities too far. I am simply talking about rhetoric. Extraordinary conviction in Donald Trump that he is in a position to solve the problems, to redress the nation's grievances. He knows what those grievances are. He has that understanding of the people, and he and no one else is the person to do it. So a very, very remarkable inaugural address altogether, and I haven't even begun to discuss the various actual points that it made. Now, the other very interesting thing about this inaugural address is that it tended to skirt away from discussions of foreign policy. Now, he did mention a few topics. He spoke about how we have a government that has given unlimited funding to the defense of foreign borders, and that has to refer to Ukraine, but refuses to defend American borders, or more importantly, its own people. And he also talks elsewhere at some very considerable length about the Panama Canal, about how Panama betrayed its trust and has left the Panama Canal effectively under China's control, and of his determination to bring it back. So that was the only thing about foreign policy that he actually said, except he did also say something else, and in some respects, it is very, very important. He said that his aim was to be a peacemaker, not a warrior. He is not looking, in other words, for foreign wars. He's intending to pursue a policy of peace. Now, that, again, is a break from what we have seen recently. More conventional political leaders who went to the rotunda in the Capitol and delivered an inaugural address, would have spoken at length about how the US's resolve is undented, how it will stand firmly by its allies, that the allies need have no fear about the strength and firmness of the United States in carrying out its commitments. And any other president, Democrat or Republican, would, I am sure, have referenced Ukraine and would have been saying something about it, and not just Ukraine, but Israel, Taiwan, a whole lot of other places. But not Donald Trump, he talks instead about peace, about wanting to be the president who is going to be remembered as a peacemaker, not as the president who is going to basically involve the United States in further endless wars. And again, I have to say this, I haven't really heard any other US president talk in that way, certainly in their inaugural address. Well, certainly not in my lifetime. So, an interesting, very interesting speech. In some ways, the quality of it goes beyond the mood. The quality of it, the mood of it, I think transcends the detail. You have a man who is now president of the United States who's convinced that he is able to solve the nation's problems, and he is listing what those problems are, and those problems are essentially domestic. He's going to focus on domestic policies, and as he put it, my proudest legacy will be that of a peacemaker and unifier. That's what I want to be, a peacemaker and unifier. We will measure our success not only by the battles we will win, but also by the wars that we end, and perhaps most importantly, the wars we never get into. So, in some ways, quite an extraordinary, even revolutionary speech. Now, there are, this is Donald Trump, all sorts of other things. He talked about gender. He talked about, various aspects of economic policy. He talked a lot about tariffs, which I'm not going to discuss in this program. He also talked about doing something to bring inflation under control, to solve the inflation crisis, perhaps better understood in the context of the United States as a cost of living crisis. And he conceded that along with massive overspending by the federal government, about which I agree, the rise in energy costs is also partly responsible, and I agree about that also. And he blames the green policies of the outgoing administration as being, to a great extent, responsible for that. And he wants drilling to be unleashed, and he wants more oil production and more gas production, and he predicts and believes that the United States will be the world's greatest oil and gas producer. I'm not sure, by the way, whether he is justified in expecting either of those things, but never mind. Anyway, he talks a lot about that, but here I think there is already a conflict on the part of his intentions, because even if he moves ahead and ends all subsidies to electric cars, allows petrol-driven cars once again to be sold on equal terms to electric cars. By the way, I wonder what his friend Elon Musk makes of that, but never mind. Even as he says all of that, even as he talks about increasing American oil and gas production, he doesn't seem to understand that doing that is going to take time. Maybe a year, maybe 2 years. Of course, in 2 years' time, we get the midterm elections, and in the midterm elections, the pendulum in the United States has a way of swinging back. And if Americans are caught up in a severe cost of living crisis, or if the cost of living crisis that they have been through under the Biden administration persists, then there is a real risk, political risk, that pendulum will swing back even further, perhaps depriving Trump of his control of Congress. So, what can he do to bring that cost of living crisis to an end? Well, I have discussed this in many programs. He can relax the energy sanctions on Russia. Now, that doesn't mean the United States has to import energy from Russia. Doesn't need to import oil or gas. Donald Trump is probably right that the United States doesn't need that. In fact, I'm sure he is. The Europeans might do so, but it's understandable, perhaps, given that Trump's focus is overwhelmingly on promoting the interests of American business, that he's putting more and more pressure on the Europeans to end their buying of Russian natural gas and oil and to increasingly buy American natural gas and oil. I would point out that doing that does risk raising prices of both oil and gas in the United States itself. Just saying. But beyond that, he can perhaps he doesn't quite realize that the major problem with the oil and gas sanctions that the Biden administration has imposed on the Russian energy industry is not that it has prevented sales or reduced sales of Russian oil and gas to the Europeans and to the Americans. It might be a problem for the Europeans. It may not be so much of a problem to the Americans. It is rather that it is putting obstacles in the way of the efficient operation of global energy markets. Now, I have spoken about this in great detail in many, many programs. Keeping the energy sanctions in place is going to create systemic problems in the global market for energy. And because prices, even in places like Singapore and China and India, are going to be higher as a result of these sanctions than they would otherwise have been, the same inevitably is going to be true in Europe and in the United States itself, even if the United States is able to increase its production. So, if the president really does want to bring inflation down, really does want to address the cost of living crisis that Americans face, he needs to think very hard about the wisdom of these sanctions. The energy sanctions. Maybe other sanctions, he can just leave them where they are. But the energy sanctions, it seems to me, are causing increasing problems for the Western economies, even as the Russians show a further ability, as they're doing at the moment, to absorb them. The ruble, by the way, has further appreciated against the dollar, and as of the time of making of this program, it is now trading at below 100 rubles to the dollar. Just saying. So, there we are. President Trump, does need to think through his priorities. Apparently, the word is out that he wants to keep all of the sanctions in place on the Russians until there is some kind of resolution of the Ukrainian conflict. If he thinks that that is going to give him leverage over the Russians, then, to say it straightforwardly, he is mistaken. The former Polish foreign minister, the former Polish president, Mr. Kwiatkowski, has said that, in fact, the United States, Kwasniewski, has in fact said that the leverage that the Americans actually have over the Russians is very limited. And these are the words. Apparently he said this in an interview with a Polish radio station. Trump has weak hands. The Russians are capable of waging the war for much longer while the Ukrainians are running out of manpower and cannot do without assistance. This is not the most favorable position in talks with Putin. And Kwasniewski is absolutely right, thinking that by maintaining the energy sanctions on Russia, that is giving the United States leverage, is, to say it straightforwardly, wrong. And enlarging those sanctions, going beyond the sanctions we already have, is only going to compound the error. But probably, Trump himself hasn't thought all of these things through. He's only just become president. He's not yet got all of the advice he needs from the various officials, from the Treasury and the Commerce Department and all of those. And maybe after he's heard from them and after he's heard from Putin himself, then he might start to change his views. Now, Putin himself has been speaking, and he spoke at a meeting of Russia's Security Council. As I've discussed in many programs, this is Russia's top decision-making body. It is virtually ignored. In fact, it is almost completely ignored by the Western media. But in Russia, it is taken extremely seriously indeed. And I do not know of any important decision that Putin has ever made in which he has not consulted the Security Council first. But anyway, Putin had a meeting with the Security Council. They discussed the global situation. They discussed the situation in the Middle East. They discussed the situation in Syria. They discussed the Gaza ceasefire. They discussed, to a certain extent, to a limited extent, the issue of Ukraine. And Putin had some actually rather favorable things to say about Trump. He made comments like this: everyone is trying to guess what official approaches the Trump administration will promote. Unofficially, members of his team and he himself have repeatedly spoken out about the Middle East and the Ukraine crisis, which Trump considers a priority area of his foreign policy activity with an eye to resolving it, making it clear that they understand the Russian position in some of its aspects, for example, regarding the unacceptability of Ukraine's membership in the North Atlantic Alliance. Then comes the qualifier. However, let me repeat that all of these are preliminary statements, more like test runs made on the eve of the new president, the new president's official inauguration and the approval of members of his administration. In fact, I just realized these are not Putin's words, these are Lavrov's. But as we will see, Putin essentially adopts them. And then, in fact, Lavrov, not Putin, says, we are open to contacts. We have repeatedly confirmed this in response to relevant questions, with the understanding that we will have serious proposals from those of our colleagues who once suspended, even broke off relations with the Russian Federation. And then Putin responds, regarding the developments in the United States today, in Washington, Donald Trump is being inaugurated as the 47th President of the United States. Undoubtedly, the pre-election phase was challenging for Mr. Trump in every aspect. He, along with his family members, faced constant and intense pressure, including attempts on his life. Nevertheless, he demonstrated resilience and achieved a decisive electoral victory. We observe that the newly elected president and his team have expressed a desire to re-establish direct contact with Russia, which the outgoing administration has severed through no fault of our own. Furthermore, we note his remarks on the necessity of doing everything possible to avert a third world war. Naturally, we welcome this stance and extend our congratulations to the president-elect on his inauguration. I wish to emphasize that we have never declined dialogue and have always been prepared to sustain amicable and cooperative relations with any American administration, as I have reiterated on numerous occasions. We are also open to dialogue with the new administration concerning the Ukrainian conflict. The primary focus here should be addressing the root causes of the crisis, which we have discussed extensively. Concerning the resolution of the situation itself, I would like to reiterate that its objective would not be a temporary ceasefire or a pause to regroup forces and rearm for the eventual continuation of the conflict, but rather a lasting peace founded on respect for the legitimate interests of all individuals and peoples residing in this region. We will steadfastly advocate for the interests of Russia and the Russian people. This, in essence, is the purpose and meaning of the special military operation. So the Russians are basically saying to Trump, look, we've heard all the things you say. We like many of the things you say. We welcome the fact that you want to resume dialogue with us. We are keen to restart that dialogue. And absolutely, we are willing to discuss Ukraine and to listen to your ideas. But you must understand that we have our own interests. We are not going to agree to a temporary ceasefire. We are not going to agree to a freeze. We're not going to agree to a Korean-style armistice or a German-style division. We want a complete, final, and full peace, which will make us safe and secure our western border. And that obviously means that Ukraine cannot enter NATO, but it means many, many other things as well. And if you believe that you can force us or bully us or bribe us into changing our stance on this, then you are gravely mistaken and the war will go on. So that is what the Russians are saying. Now, some will say that this is a position that the Russians are taking, a hardline position that the Russians are taking in advance of negotiations. When the negotiations really begin, they're going to moderate their positions significantly. Now, I cannot obviously definitely say that that is wrong, but I have to say I think it is, because going back to the points that were made by Mr. Kwasniewski, the Russians are winning the war. They've absorbed the sanctions blows. They think Ukraine is sufficiently important to wage war over it. Why, therefore, would they make concessions that they don't need to make, compromising their own security in the process, simply because the Americans want them to? And I think that is, again, to reiterate something that the Americans, the Trump people, need to understand. Now, going back to President Trump's inaugural address, it was very remarkable that he did not mention either Russia or Ukraine anywhere in the speech. Those two countries are not referenced. That tends to reinforce the view that I have seen expressed that Donald Trump does not consider Ukraine an important area of strategic interest to the United States. In which case, perhaps Trump is willing to make compromises with the Russians, understanding that it is the Ukrainians that must give ground in order to achieve an agreement, not the Russians. So there we are. That's, I think, a very interesting exchange of views between Putin and Trump. Obviously, they're not speaking to each other, though it's expected that they will do so at some point within the next few days. We now have confirmation that steps are being taken to arrange that call. And one way or the other, the dialogue is underway, but the Russians are standing firm. Now, a number of other things have happened over the course of yesterday which are suggestive, though it's difficult to say at the moment how important they are actually going to prove to be. Now, one of them was that amongst a whole dozens, scores of executive orders that President Trump signed off in the hours after his inauguration, he signed off one executive order about foreign assistance. And it reads, by the authority vested in me as President by the Constitution and the laws of the United States, it is hereby ordered, Section 1, purpose, from this day forward, the foreign policy of the United States shall champion core American interests and always put America and American citizens first. Section 2, policy, as soon as practicable, the Secretary of State, which is to say Marco Rubio, who has just been confirmed in that post, by the way, by the Senate, the Secretary of State shall issue guidance bringing the Department of State's policies, programs, personnel, which might imply some sackings of some people, just saying, and operations in line with an American first foreign policy, which puts America and its interests first. Section 3, general provisions. A, nothing in this order shall be construed to impair or otherwise affect 1, the authority granted by law to an executive department or agency, or 2, the functions of the Director of the Office of Management and Budget relating to budgetary, administrative, or legislative proposals. B, this order shall be implemented consistent with applicable law and subject to the availability of appropriations. And C, this order is not intended to and does not create any right or benefit, substantive or procedural, enforceable at law or in equity by any party against the United States, its departments, agencies or entities, its officers, employees or agents or any other person. So that is the entirety of the executive order. And the key words here, the key words apparently are that the foreign policy of the United States shall champion core American interests and always put America and American citizens first. Now, if Donald Trump does not believe that Ukraine is a core American interest, and he has sometimes given that impression, in fact, he is very often given that impression, and Bloomberg, of course, has said that amongst his officials, that is the view, that is the opinion that Trump holds, then logically aid to Ukraine is covered by this order. Now, I have to say, I don't think this order automatically and immediately means in and of itself that the aid flow to Ukraine is going to stop. There has to be a determination by Marco Rubio, though he, despite his neocon background, is for the moment singing from the same hymn sheet, if I can put it like that, as Donald Trump about Ukraine and other things. But anyway, Rubio has to review all of this. And, of course, there are American legal provisions that need to be taken into account of. For example, in April, Congress voted, by my recollection, a $91 billion aid package for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan, of which $61 billion was assigned to Ukraine. We are told that there is $3.8 billion of that money still left. It is therefore mandated to be used on behalf of Ukraine by Congress, and it might be legally impossible for Donald Trump simply to overturn that, to cancel that. Just saying. So it doesn't mean that American aid to Ukraine is immediately going to stop. It doesn't mean that American aid to Ukraine is going to stop at all. Trump has all the leeway he needs in this very, very vaguely drafted executive order to maintain aid to Ukraine if he thinks it is in American core interests to do so. It's up to him at the end of the day. We have an executive order which would, in theory at least, block further aid to Ukraine if a determination was made in Washington that further aid to Ukraine over and above the $3.8 billion already allocated by Congress, further aid to Ukraine is not worthwhile because Ukraine is not a core American interest. And Bloomberg tells us that Donald Trump doesn't think Ukraine is a core American interest. And we've seen other comments that he has made which seem to reinforce that view. He's spoken about prioritizing defense of the border over defense of other countries' borders. And recently, in his inaugural address, he carefully avoided any mention of Ukraine, as if saying that he doesn't think the conflict there is very important. Now, Trump has been saying some other things, however. He says that Zelensky has indicated that he's prepared to sit down and conduct negotiations with the Russians. I don't know where Donald Trump gets that idea, because nothing I have seen Zelensky say actually says that. He did talk back in the autumn about a diplomatic settlement of the conflict, but then he hastened to make clear that what he was looking for was a diplomatic settlement that would not involve negotiations. A diplomatic settlement where the Russians would be presented by the West with an ultimatum to back down, and that, according to Zelensky, would be enough to end the war. So I don't know where Trump gets the idea that Zelensky is in fact interested in negotiations. But I'm going to suggest that there is something else going on here. This executive order is, if you like, a threat to Zelensky. It's telling him, look, if you don't cooperate with us in the United States, we will cut off the flow of aid to you. We've issued an executive order which authorizes us to do it, and we will indeed go ahead and do it. And that may explain why Donald Trump is making these comments about Zelensky being ready to conduct negotiations. What Donald Trump is doing is, in effect, he's bullying Zelensky to come to the negotiating table. He's saying to Zelensky, you negotiate with the Russians or else we will cut off your aid. We've passed this executive order. It will enable us to do that because we don't think Ukraine is a core interest. You know perfectly well that you cannot win the war without us, so it is in your interests to do that which you have at various times implied that you might be willing to do, but which in fact you have never agreed to do, which is sit down and negotiate with the Russians. So that, I think, is what is going on. The big unanswered question is what is going to happen when Trump meets Putin. Is he going to try and use the same tactics with Putin? Is he going to try to bully Putin in the same way as he has just bullied Zelensky? Zelensky, for the record, is deeply upset about all of this. He's said that he wasn't interested in the inauguration. He didn't watch the inauguration ceremony because he had more important things to do. He's basically given a clear impression of a man in a massive sulk, which, by the way, I think he is. But let's not think too much about him. Is this same tactic going to work with the Russians? Well, I've discussed what Putin said. I've discussed what Lavrov said at the Security Council meeting. I don't think it will. Moreover, the Russians are now busy again talking to their friends. Yesterday, even as Trump was being inaugurated in Washington, Putin had a 95-minute telephone conversation with the Chinese president, Xi Jinping. Now, the Kremlin has provided us with some details of the conversation. But essentially, these are limited to the statements that the two leaders made at the start of their discussions. It was interesting that Xi Jinping did refer to Putin as his dear friend. Just saying. The Kremlin isn't providing us, though, with much more information about this call. I've not yet seen the Chinese readout. I expect it will come out over the next couple of hours. My strong impression about the call is that its primary purpose was to recommit China and Russia to their energy partnership. The Russians have already built one massive gas pipeline to China, which is Power of Siberia 1. It is now supplying gas to China at full capacity and did so as of last year. Another spur of the Power of Siberia pipeline is going to be built, Power of Siberia 2, and we're now told that it will cross Central Asia, it will cross Kazakhstan. And the Chinese and the Russians are apparently in agreement that this will happen. Now, I read some rather interesting articles by the analyst, Andrew Karibko, which I'm going to mention here because while I think he can be an interesting analyst, I think on this one, he's got it all profoundly wrong. He seems to think that, as many people do, that the Russians are selling their gas to the Chinese at absolutely bargain basement prices, that it is hardly viable to sell their gas to the Chinese at the current prices. He seems skeptical the Power of Siberia 2 will ever be built. And, well, he says that the Russians are selling gas to the Chinese at bargain basement prices or at the price of domestic gas inside Russia itself. He takes that from an article in the Financial Times. Now, I have to say straight away that I don't consider the Financial Times to be a reliable authority on these kind of questions. My own understanding is that the Russians are selling gas to the Chinese at significantly more than the domestic price, not as much as the price they used to get from the Europeans, but the gas flow is reliable and uninterrupted, and it doesn't cause the Russians any problems. Now, the point is that both the Chinese and the Russians have an incentive to develop this partnership. The Russians, because they need to sell their gas, and selling it by pipelines, of course, makes sense. And also the Chinese, because increasingly they are refocusing their economy on nuclear power and gas consumption. If we're talking about the Chinese motor vehicle industry, for example, as I understand it, even as China moves forward with plans to develop electric vehicle passenger cars, for commercial vehicles, the Chinese are looking at some form of liquefied gas. And obviously, given how important it is to move trucks around China, the place that they're going to get that gas from, as they hope, ultimately will be Russia. So gas usage in China is likely to grow, and that, I think, is why Putin and Xi Jinping met. Now, from what I've heard, both the Russians and the Chinese about these issues are unbelievably tough negotiators. They bargain relentlessly about the price, and they bargain relentlessly about the route, but they do eventually come to an agreement, and the agreement, when it's reached, is solid. There is none of that endless renegotiation and rediscussion of the pipeline that we saw with all of the Russian pipelines to Europe. So the Russians are clearly already moving forward with supplies of gas to China. They're working towards developing this relationship. It doesn't mean that they might not develop a similar relationship with other countries, with India and Iran, for example. But I am absolutely clear in my mind that this deal between the Russians and the Chinese is absolutely for real. And no one should be in any doubt about this. And the fact that the ruble has strengthened over the last couple of days has many causes. The dollar, for one thing, has weakened to a certain degree. But the fact that it's strengthened doesn't suggest that there are any serious worries about Russia's financial position in the global markets, or at least those markets that still trade in Russian debt, the Russian ruble, and in Russian debt. So, just saying, the Russians, they will no doubt experience problems if the Trump administration imposes more sanctions. But I don't think that it is the killer blow that perhaps some people in the United States think it is. Dmitry Suslov, who is a senior Russian analyst, he is deputy director of the Center for Comprehensive European and International Studies at the High School of Economics. He said, I think that the next few months, the increase in sanctions pressure from the United States on Russia is simply inevitable, and this should be considered as a baseline scenario. The fact is that as soon as the Trump administration comes to the conclusion that the negotiations will be very difficult and that Russia has its own position, which does not coincide with the US position, they will be interested in increasing pressure upon us. Of course, sanctions against the Russian energy sector will be tightened, and Russia's partners will be threatened even more with secondary sanctions. However, Suslov then goes on to say, the main limitation that the Trump administration will have here is the risk of inflation in the United States itself, because if sanctions destabilize Russian oil exports, it's clear that world prices will rise, and this is associated with increased inflation in the United States, which is exactly the point I made a short while before. So we are in a complicated game of poker, but it's a game of poker in which the Russians hold the high cards. Again, that perhaps bears reiterating, because I still don't think there is a huge degree of understanding of this fact in the United States and elsewhere in the West. Now, we've had two pieces of information from the Ukrainian side that tell us that the situation for Ukraine is getting worse and worse. Firstly, we had some comments from Ukraine's military chief, General Syrskyi. Now, it's difficult for me to get a clear picture of what General Syrskyi is saying, because as far as I can see, he's made several comments scattered over several interviews, and people are putting them together. And that makes it very difficult to get the overall sense of what he is saying. But my impression is that he is firstly confirming Mariana Bezuglaya's claim that the Ukrainian military has been forced to redeploy logistics and air defense troops to the front lines to act as infantry. Syrskyi goes out of his way to say that this is not going to have any significant effect on the viability of the air defense system, because specialists and people of that kind are not going to be affected by this further conscription. Just saying. But Syrskyi also said that at the moment, losses on the battlefield are exceeding fresh recruits from the conscription program. And in fact, there's article after article, including in the Ukrainian media now, which says that the situation for many brigades across the front line is becoming desperate because they are so thinly manned and overextended that they're struggling to hold back the Russians. And, well, the other article, which is in some ways even more interesting, comes from the Daily Telegraph. And the Daily Telegraph cannot ever be faulted for taking anything else but an incredibly optimistic view of the state of the war in Ukraine from a Ukrainian perspective. And the article is by the same journalist and Adrian Blomfield, who wrote that other article, which I discussed 2 or 3 days ago, about the discussions between Starmer and Zelensky. The discussions which alarmed me incredibly and which suggested that Trump's concerns about potential World War III are far from groundless. Anyway, this latest article is very different. It says, Ukraine loses one of its few advantages on the front line. Kiev may struggle to win support as Donald Trump administration begins. And then we're told that there was a time not long ago when young Ukrainian drone operators could take out Russian tanks and armored vehicles almost at will. That, of course, is a wild exaggeration. Just over 6 months ago, Darwin, to use the radio call sign by which he prefers to be known, racked up a personal record by single-handedly destroying or damaging 9 combat vehicles in one day. This is no longer the case. In recent months, the Russians have become more adept at electronically jamming FPV drones, and Darwin's battalion which once operated with such devastating consequences along the Kupiansk front line. And we then go on to read, it is, Darwin reckons, one of the main reasons, greater perhaps than Russia's manpower advantage, that Ukraine is on the back foot, not just around the embattled town of Kupiansk, but along much of the 700-mile front line. And we're told that Kupiansk is now increasingly encircled. We're told that there is also an operational crisis in Pakrovsk. We're told that the Russian progress has been slow, often glacial, with outnumbered Ukrainian troops frequently and bravely holding their own. But there is no doubt that the front line is fraying in several places, testing the resolve of the Ukrainian people amid growing skepticism in Washington. So, we are being told here in the Daily Telegraph that readers of the Daily Telegraph, and this might come as a shock to some of them, are being told that the war in Ukraine is being lost, that Ukraine is short of men, that its drones don't work anymore in the way that they once did, that the Russians have exceptional manpower and material advantages, and realistically, there is no way that that can be reversed. And then the article also tells us that there is growing war weariness in Ukraine. Mr. Blomfield found several people who said that they felt negotiations were needed and who seemed to take issue with Zelensky's stance, though I noticed that they were very vague in setting out what kind of proposals they think would be acceptable. So, trying to pressure the Russians, as the Trump administration is likely to do, all it's going to do is prolong the war and make Ukraine's defeat even worse than it might otherwise be. It's worth pointing out that as of this moment in time, Putin's proposals, taken objectively, are not unreasonable. He says the 4 oblasts, which he largely controls now and will control completely in a few months, along with probably a lot more other territory as well. He wants certain changes in the internal arrangements in Ukraine, which the Ukrainians largely agreed to in Istanbul. He wants restrictions on the size of the Ukrainian armed forces and certain provisions for security guarantees which will affect Russia as well as Ukraine and which will give the Russians some say over what foreign troops are deployed on Ukrainian territory. And of course, he wants Ukraine not to join NATO. He's discussed this repeatedly, going all the way back to the early 2000s when he first became president, and Russian officials have always made it clear that for them that is a red line. And Trump, at least, now appears to accept that. So, the best thing to do, the most logical thing to do, would be for Trump. He's got enormous leverage over Zelensky. The executive order gives him that. He can tell Zelensky, look, this is the situation. You're losing the war. The United States cannot go on sending you arms and weapons and economic aid. We got far more serious problems closer to home. You are, let's face it, not a core interest of the United States. Sit down and talk to the Russians. Revoke your decree whereby you refused to talk with the Russians and basically accept their terms. We can live with the terms, and so must you. Well, we will see what happens. Whether the Europeans accept that, whether anybody accepts that, whether there will be intense opposition within Washington. At the moment, as became clear from his inaugural address, Trump has the momentum behind him. But we can't be sure that that will always be the case. It could be that if he starts explaining these difficult truths to Zelensky and the Ukrainians, opposition against him will coalesce first in Europe and then possibly in the United States itself. Now, there is something else to say about these meetings and discussions that took place yesterday, and in particular, the conversation between Putin and Xi, which is, of course, they will have discussed and coordinated with each other their positions with respect to Donald Trump. The Russians and the Chinese will be very careful to inform each other of what each intends to say to Donald Trump and where their red lines are. And whilst the Chinese and the Russians are not going to agree joint negotiating position on all of these many different issues, Taiwan and Ukraine and all of that, that would be absurd. They will each negotiate on the issue that concerns them. Nonetheless, they will support each other over the course of the negotiations. I say that because I think there continues to be an illusion in the United States that China and Russia can continue to be played off against each other in the way that the United States successfully did during the Cold War. I think that is an illusion. I think the Russians certainly, and the Chinese probably, have learnt the lessons of that quarrel. Conditions in the world are very different today, and I think that they will be coordinating very carefully with each other. So there we are. That is the situation. I would be remiss of me not to say a little about the military situation in Ukraine. From what I can tell, the most dramatic information is coming from Chasiv Yar and from the bridgehead north of Kupiansk. It looks as if the Russians have significantly enlarged that bridgehead, and that the small town of Dvorichne is now firmly under their control, putting them in a very strong position to advance either towards Kupiansk or to advance westwards, cutting off Kupiansk from resupply, if that is what they decide to do. I mean, I don't know. I'm not in a position to second guess their thinking. And, well, looking at the maps that have appeared over the last 24 hours, it does look as if the Russians have now broken the back of Ukrainian resistance in Chasiv Yar. The Ukrainians still control some districts of Chasiv Yar, but my sense is that they probably control only around 20% of the town. And it looks as if the Russians are now in control of all of the strong positions. We've heard nothing over the last 24 hours from Toretsk and Velikaya Novosilka, which suggests to me that the Russians took a decision not to pour water on Trump's parade by announcing the capture of those two places on the same day as Trump's inauguration. I can see, by the way, why they would do that. And we're also getting further news of more Russian advances in the area of Pokrovsk. And in fact, there are now growing statements that the situation around Pokrovsk for the Ukrainians is becoming impossibly difficult. There's a statement now by a Ukrainian military official, a former deputy chief of Ukraine's general staff, Lieutenant General Igor Romanenko. He spoke about measures to counter the advance by the Russians and stated that the Ukrainian army had long been unable to halt it, in particular due to the absence of well-organized mobilization. This is due to the existing situation with the provision of armament, equipment, and ammunition on the one hand, and in this regard, we're strongly dependent on the West's aid, and on the other hand, the issue of mobilization and thus deliveries and personnel training in accordance with the requirements of the Ukrainian armed forces has not been resolved in the past 3 years. And we're told that this was said by him over the course of an interview with Politeka online YouTube channel. And Romanenko said that based on what he knew, in answer to the question, will Ukraine have sufficient forces and resources to hold Pokrovsk, he replied, unfortunately, I don't think so, given the available resources. He went on to say that the situation in the Pokrovsk area is indeed difficult and deteriorating. Since I am on the topic of Pokrovsk, there are now reports that the Russians have actually reached the outskirts of the famous coal mine which produces the coking coal upon which Ukraine's steel industry depends. I think, as I said, the importance of this coal mine has perhaps been overstated, but definitely production now has stopped and the Russians are very close to its capture. So that's the military situation. Now, I do want to discuss some other topics that have happened. Firstly, I have to say something, though very briefly, about the outgoing president's, Joe Biden's, decision to pardon a whole lot of people yesterday, people who, so far as I know, have not been charged or investigated for any offence whatsoever. I am at a total loss to understand the logic of this. How can someone be pardoned for an offence of which everyone else knows nothing? I mean, we have no information what any of these people are supposed to have done. Of course, there's been stories and rumours and gossip in the media, but we have had nothing definite. This decision to grant this pardon of a huge number of people has left me speechless. Again, I don't pretend I understand it. It seems to me wholly illogical. But I accept that it is legal and that it is a legal exercise of the president's rights under the Constitution. That does surprise me. But anyway, I accept that because that's what every single American jurist I have consulted says. I just express my bewilderment about it. I do, however, express my further bewilderment about the former president's claim that the 28th Amendment, the Equal Rights Amendment, is operative law, is now part of the Constitution of the United States, even though an insufficient number of states have ratified it. Again, I am completely unable to understand the reasoning behind this claim. Most people that I know reject completely the president's claim on this issue. Inevitably, there are some who support it, but for the record, I myself don't understand it. This is what I'm going to say about that. Both of these incidents point to me to the complete detachment from reality that the previous administration is retreating into in the last weeks of its existence. That's what I will say. Now, other things are going on. I discussed the gas issues at considerable length. It looks as if Fico, who is still Prime Minister of Slovakia, though there are attempts to remove him from that office through a no-confidence vote. Anyway, it looks as if Fico is trying to arrange some kind of consortium that will supply gas to Slovakia from Russia through the Turk Stream pipeline. Erdogan and Orban have said that they support that proposal. Erdogan says that he intends to speak to Putin about it. And perhaps that is what is going to happen. Now, Fico, assuming he remains Prime Minister, does have time. He does have a certain amount of time. There is still significant amount of gas in Slovakia's reserves. And conceivably, possibly, if all of these four leaders, Putin, Fico, Orban and Erdogan, get together, they can resume supplies of gas to Hungary and Slovakia through the Turk Stream pipelines. I understand, by the way, that Vučić, the president of Serbia, who is, by the way, also facing an internal crisis. Anyway, he apparently is also on board with this idea. And of course, Turk Stream passes through Serbia as well. Whether this is possible, I am not sure. I assume that the Turk Stream pipelines, or the pipelines that connect to Turk Stream and to the Serbian pipeline network, which is in effect an extension of Turk Stream, also pass through Bulgaria and perhaps Greece, which are not friendly countries in this matter. But I'm going to leave that discussion to another day. Now, as for support for Transnistria, it's clearly impossible for the Russians to ship gas directly to Transnistria. They would have to pass through Ukrainian territory, and for the moment that really isn't an option. There is some talk that the Russians, however, buy gas for Transnistria in the European gas market, and that this gas is then resupplied to Transnistria basically for free. Now, again, there are obvious problems with this, which is that though this is an attractive idea in theory, it would require the European states, including Romania, by the way, to cooperate with this, and presumably Moldova too. Would they actually do so? Again, I don't know. I don't know what the leverage is, but negotiations, discussions of some kind are taking place at this present time between all of these various parties. All of this, by the way, as protests in Romania against the annulment of the recent election grow and are beginning to spread outside the capital city. At least that is my understanding of the situation. So anyway, there's all of that. Now, there is an important further matter, and it touches on the situation in the Middle East. On Sunday, the Gaza ceasefire came into effect, and for the moment it is holding. Moreover, it looks as if Prime Minister Netanyahu has seen off political challenges. Ben Gvir resigned from the cabinet, but he's already saying that he might return. And Smotrich resigned from the cabinet on Sunday, but then he did choose to return on Monday. I find that completely unsurprising. They are in a far better position, these people, to radicalize Israeli society according to their ideas from within the government as opposed to outside it. So I don't think that they're really going in any great rush to quit the government in the way that they have been saying. But in the meantime, exactly as I expected, Hamas fighters have poured into the streets of Gaza, and they're driving around in trucks and cars, which the Israelis were telling us they had destroyed in large number. Well, probably they did destroy them in large number, but some, a sufficient number, seem to have survived. And Hamas's police is back in business. I appreciate many people would challenge whether or not it is a police, but from what I can tell, most people in Gaza seem to be welcoming it. And of course, all of this is coming as a shock in Israel itself and amongst some people in the United States. The destruction of Hamas that Israelis and Westerners, above all Americans, were promised has not happened. Nor could it have done. I've discussed in previous programs what Alistair Crook and Daniel Davis, both people who've been to Gaza, say about the impossibility of the kind of military operation that Israel conducted in Gaza succeeding. And both Alistair Crook and Daniel Davis have turned out to be absolutely correct. That, however, brings us back to the former president. Now, I have to admit here that I have not followed all of the interviews that he has been giving in the last days of his presidency. But I understand that in one interview, he did actually say that he told Netanyahu before the Israeli offensive in Gaza began in October 2023 that it would result in thousands of civilian casualties and that the damage done would be disproportionate. According to the clip of the interview that I have seen, Biden even said that it really makes sense to blow up an entire building with 1,500 people in it in order to kill one Hamas leader. And according to Biden, and this is again in the clip I've seen, and it may be that this was cut and edited in some fashion in order to put him in a bad light, though I wonder. Anyway, according to the clip I've seen, Netanyahu came back and said, well, yes, there is this concern, but ultimately it's the only way of getting to the people who are killing our people. Now, Biden then goes on to say that he accepted that logic, and as we know, he then went on to give Prime Minister Netanyahu a blank check. I find that, if I've understood this whole exchange correctly, I find that absolutely astonishing. Not just astonishing, but deeply concerning. I would say immoral. Any political leader, before he goes to war, ought to try every available means, or at least every reasonable means, to resolve a conflict peacefully before resorting to force. I would argue that that is what Putin did over the special military operation in Ukraine. He negotiated with the Ukrainians and the Western powers a series of discussions and negotiations going all the way back to the 2014 crisis. You may still disagree with Putin's final decision to launch the SMO, but the fact remains that you can't say that he didn't make serious efforts to resolve the conflict peacefully. Just saying. It looks as if neither Netanyahu nor Biden gave that idea any thought. Now, I set out in many programs why I think there was another way. Going to the Security Council, getting a resolution under Chapter 7, backing it with sanctions, getting the Arab states and the Muslim states on board, piling on the pressure on Hamas in that way. Many people have scorned this suggestion, and that, of course, is their right. But I ask the question, shouldn't it at least have been tried before starting a military operation like the one in Gaza, which we have seen, which, apart from killing tens of thousands of people in Gaza, has basically failed. Well, this is where I finish today's programme. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programmes on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Please remember to tick the like button if you've liked this video, and please also, if you've liked this video and want to support this channel, check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.